Welcome once again to the National Newspaper Publishers Association, our national series and dialogues on education. And this is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we're very pleased today to have a distinguished, how can I describe Hilary Shelton? Hilary Shelton. Hilary is not only director of the Washington, D.C. office of the NAACP, but I've known Brother Shelton for a long time. If anybody knows how DC works, how public policy works, how the members of the Congressional Black Caucus work, the Congress itself, it is Hilary Shelton. Hilary, thank you and welcome to this interview for the Black Press of America.
Ben, I'm deeply honored to be here. It is always great to see you. I don't want to give away too much, but I met you when you were working for the United Church of Christ
Commission for Racial Justice.
Making college student, but we'll keep that to ourselves for the time being.
Well, I was just saying to one of my colleagues that you, I, and Damu Smith, we were doing some great work, even for Angola at the time, as you recall.
Oh, absolutely. Bless his heart. I miss Damu very much. He was a brother, as you know, that believed in teaching.
Yes.
I'll never forget as I went to work for the Washington Office on Africa, walking across the grounds of the Capitol building.
Yeah, absolutely.
He said, Hilary, said, this is probably what the most powerful campus you've ever been on. And I was straight out of college and whatnot.
Exactly. Yes, indeed. And another one of Andy Young's daughters, I knew you married one of Andy Young's daughters, right. But her sister was also chair of the Washington Office on Africa, and I was also president of the Washington Office on Africa. And we all worked together on the issues that affect African Americans, but issues that affect African people throughout the world.
Absolutely.
But today we want to focus on education.
Yes.
The landscape. We were very interested in your perspective. As you know, Hilary, before the pandemic, there was an education gap between African American students and other students in public education, primarily in pre-K through 12. When it came to the third grade reading test, we were not doing well across the country. But now with the pandemic, or now schools are in sort of a distance education mode, a lot is done virtually, it seems that the gap is widening. So the first question I want to ask you from an NAACP perspective, what do you think needs to be done with the new incoming Biden-Harris administration? They haven't named yet, but they soon will, who will be education secretary. But regardless of who the secretary is, what are some of the top 3 public policy things that you think should be done to improve the educational opportunity, to improve the educational, not only access, but excellence, achievement of Black people in public schools today?
That's a very important question. The things that we've seen actually transition throughout. So for instance, we had that problem coming out of the Bush administration, the so-called No Child Left Behind Act and other issues along those lines that were supposed to be helpful, but they weren't. The focus was not on the process itself of education and making sure education was effectively to everyone. The focus is really on testing and actually the education industry to make more money towards privatization and a number of other things that became truly problematic. You may remember we had to come out against the so-called No Child Left Behind Act, particularly on provisions of what we call high stakes testing. That is the misunderstanding that if a child doesn't get the testing right, they should go back and do the whole thing again, when the realization should be the process didn't work very well for this child this time. Let's talk about how we can make it work for them and actually be able to understand the lesson plans, understand the issues that are before them, and continue to move forward. In other words, we've seen too often, it's almost like the skipping on your tape player or on your CD player, where it continues to play the same thing over and over again, but you still never make your way through the entire song.
Right.
It skip around the same way. We had those problems. So we're thinking about the top 3 issues. It'll be first, of course, education quality and funding. Funding's a big part of it. We know that within that, guys, that we have a real problem with how the funding process is done. As you know, if we're thinking about public education, about 10% of all public education dollars come from the federal government. That leaves the other 90% to the local communities and the states across the country that have a hodgepodge of, in many cases, very problematic systems in which they raise funds. If we're in poor communities and about 70 or 80% of African-American children in households that are at or below the poverty line. If we're thinking in those terms, that means they're living in communities in which the property values are lower. Most often we get our resources that pay for public education through those property taxes. But the property values are lower, the taxes are lower too, the revenues fewer. And that means that what we're doing is struggling with a system that is not providing the real support. I come from St. Louis, Missouri, that has some of the biggest problems in the country being able to fairly subsidize and help pay for public education. So we've got to fix that system. It's broken. Some communities still have a system in which if you live in a poor neighborhood, they take the money only from your neighborhood, which means there are fewer dollars there as well. And in terms of supplements, we think about Title I programs. Funding is crucial. We need more teachers. In essence, as we're looking at the African-American community, we know no one can communicate better with our children than teachers that look like them, that understand from which they've come and can help them move from wherever they are to actually educational excellence as well. The other issues as we move through that process moves us then to some problems within our public school system as we think about issues of security. Mm-hmm. Have a real problem with the so-called school to prison pipeline. It's a nice slogan, but what about in real terms, what we're talking about is we have a real problem with our children getting records for things like going through puberty. You assign police officers to be security inside of a school instead of a well-trained and disciplined person with a counseling background to deal with the misbehavior of children and treat that misbehavior as something that can be solved, that can be addressed, that can be straightened out. It makes a big difference. If you send somebody in who understands their job is when somebody misbehaves, you put the handcuffs on them, you throw them in the back of your car, and you take them to the police station, giving them a record. We once talked to a law enforcement official that's considered a resource officer. That's what they call them, as we make that transition from the streets into the schools, and asked him, what was the number one reason that he was involved in children being arrested? He said, crimes of puberty. In other words, their misbehaviors because they're going through all kinds of changes. For those of us who've raised kids, or even if we're honest about when we were kids, we had behavior and did things that we didn't understand why we were doing. We're doing them nonetheless. The only thing I would add to that is we move beyond that and want to make sure our system works for them and we plan for our children's success. Is part of that success is getting them into colleges and universities. And the challenge that we're running in now, of course, is our families are, again, disproportionately poor. What that means is that in order to provide an education for our kids, we're doing things like high stakes loans. That is, we're borrowing money to the point that if we're able to get through, we end up spending 10, sometimes 20 years paying off student loans before we can actually begin investing in the wealth and the full involvement of our country. That is, buying a home, starting a business, and other things along those lines. Been not surprising that when we heard that speech at Morehouse College,
yes,
a man stepped forward and said, look, I'm going to take care of all your loans. Everybody, once they realized they weren't dreaming, started yelling and screaming because pretty darn near everyone sitting in that graduating class had at least $40,000 worth of student loans, and some much more than that, because that was just primarily, again, those who were starting out in college and what I get in their bachelor's degrees. So with all that in mind, we've got to work on those issues as well, make those resources available, deal with that student loan debt trap, so that our kids don't find themselves in a position that they can't continue forward, or we've seen many cases where they don't want to touch those loans, which means they're actually advancing in education because they're fearful of the debt trap they're going to find themselves in. So we're working very hard along those lines as well. Some great things about all these issues first with the incoming Biden administration, those we know are in place, and certainly Mr. Biden and Kamala Harris herself, as we're talking about these issues. We're delighted to see not only said the right things about the support they want to give, but in the bills that were pending on the Hill, Mr. Biden was in the White House during this time, but Kamala Harris was supporting many of these provisions in education, loans, and financial services to help us address these concerns and make sure our kids have what they need to be able to move beyond their mom and daddy's pocketbooks and go as far as their minds, their imaginations will take them.
Very good. I know Congressman Bobby Scott, distinguished member of Congress from Virginia, is chair of the Committee on Education.
That's right.
How's the NAACP and the Committee on Education, what's the forecast for 2021 going forward in terms of public policy that will help bridge the education gap?
Listen, I'm delighted you asked about Bobby Scott because I always smile very big. Congressman Scott, as we move into the issue of talking about policy, I tease him all the time about being a product of the NAACP. See, Congressman Scott was a former branch president for the Hampton area before he became an elected official in the Virginia Commonwealth legislature, yes, and then came to Washington and served in the U.S. Congress with great distinction. So when we're looking at issues like, well, I can start off that student loan issue again. He introduced a bill that passed the House as we look at how things are being set up to move into the next Congress. As you know, we're in what's called a lame duck session right now. That means the official Congress is really in it, but there was still some business, some continuing resolutions and other things that still have to be addressed. As such, they went into a lame duck session, which means it's the session after the election, but the session in which the old team, the 116th Congress, before we move into the 117th, the 116th Congress is still in charge. So we're still trying to get some things done. But the things that are lined up as we're looking towards the first 100 days, we will hear that being talked about a lot. Look at that and moving through the next 4 years as we think about the Biden-Harris administration. And even those that are going to be in charge in the Congress, we've got some challenges. I'll just plant a seed with that for now, but then make the transition. The seed that's being planted is we've got more friends that support our agenda in the U.S. House of Representatives. And as you mentioned, Bobby Scott, we've got more CBC members, African-American members that chair important committees and subcommittees in the U.S. House of Representatives than any other time in history. That's tremendous. That's important. Delighted to see. On the Senate side, we still have a majority of folks that won't vote to support issues around education funding, around higher education funding, increasing Pell Grants, decreasing dependency on student loans, making sure kids have an opportunity again to go to school as they will. So all those things are going on at the same time. So as we're getting set up for the next move, we're trying to move, and we're getting support from the incoming administration to address many of these concerns for us. And that is, we've sent questionnaires to candidates early on. We actually brought them to the NAACP National Convention during the primaries, including Mr. Biden, Ms. Harris, and many others. We asked them the hard questions then, and they made the commitments then that they would work and the issues, and what we're seeing so far is them still lined up. We had conversations with the incoming administration. President Derek Johnson of the NAACP was just on a call with other African-American community leaders from Mark Ariel and Al Sharpton and so many others for a close session about what we need out of this administration for the communities we serve. So looking at what we're hoping to get out of this one, education issue, Bobby Scott is the man. The bills that have passed in this Congress, people will be very proud of, and I hope they'll pull them down. You can go to our website at naacp.org. You can pull down what we call our issue updates on the various bills, including the education bills that have moved forward along those lines as well. So what we're saying is a move towards increasing Title I. We want to see that. Congressman Scott wants to see that, and many of our friends on the Ed Committee and the full Congress want to see that happen as well. We recognize there's a big problem. Creating incentives to restructure the funding process for our local public schools so they're not still left to the problems of those wanting to keep money in their own communities because they have more money, upper middle class folks and beyond, and that are stuck in a system in which they actually calculate the per student resources they're going to move forward at a much lower level. Resources need to be put in place. We've got classes and challenges in which the teacher has way too many students. Let me make sure we don't forget as we're having this conversation about education, an awful foundation we're having to work with. Every issue I've mentioned as challenges and problems in our schools, public schools, colleges, and beyond are worsened by coronavirus. And that is the resources have decreased. People are losing their homes, are in the middle of losing their homes. The only thing that saved millions and upon millions of African-American families is that there's a moratorium on evicting them from their rental properties. There's a moratorium in locking them out of their mortgages at this point. And those aren't being paid off. They're simply being held aside for a moment. That means the bill is continuing to increase. So again, foundation. We want to see more, we want to see a better child to teacher ratio. We know that works. We want to upgrade the curriculum to make sure that's in place that speaks to the real experiences of folks and helps move our children to a better understanding and preparing them for higher education. We want to address the issue of making sure they don't find themselves with those criminal records we discussed. We were just on a call yesterday with not only Congressman Scott, but other friends from the House as we're looking forward to next year and wanted to make sure that those resource officers are pretty well pulled out of the schools with a new strategy. Many, many times from those, particularly in our communities, we don't need more police officers in the schools, even around the schools. Our children suffer as they're trying to go from their homes to the schools. That's where most of the shootings occur. That's where most of the fights occur and the other problems and whatnot as well. We want a very well-organized process that isn't based on just what happened at Columbine. Where the system came from, you know. They want to address larger regional schools in like rural areas, predominantly white communities and otherwise, and we're thinking of the realities of inner city schools in places like Washington, D.C., Chicago, St. Louis, and other larger cities and challenges across our country as well.
Well, thank you. You gave a very detailed answer, which we appreciate. One of the things that, as I listened to you very carefully, was the issue of educational equity. In other words, the funding, the equitable funding of schools where racial discrimination and racial disparities don't preset the situation where there will be constantly inequity rather than equity. So the question I'm gonna ask you, you started out about leave no child behind, no child left behind, then it went to ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. But now, what can be done to ensure that there's more equity of funding, particularly in those areas where African Americans, Latinos, and other people of color students, whether in distance education or in classroom education during this pandemic, but the inequitable distribution of funds seems to be so fundamental to determining whether or not a quality education is even accessible.
Well, let me just say that we are convinced it is, but it's going to require us looking at things differently. One of the challenges we run into is that this is a problem that's been with us for so long, we just call it normal. Whether it's been happening a lot, there's nothing normal about not making sure that our children get the resources they need to be able to successfully matriculate through our schools. So what that means is a couple of things. We've got to be more organized than ever before. We recognize that there's a lot of focus here in Washington, the NAACP, and so many other organizations, including our labor unions, have been extremely effective in making sure that we can address those issues here. And even if they're moving in the wrong direction, make the loud noises about what's going on and keep the attention focused as such. But the biggest problems we have is really at the state level. You see, it's at the state level that the policies are being distribution of the funds. The districts are being cut to determine how the resources are going to go out, who gets them, and how we address things like poor communities versus richer communities. And there's a debate that's been going on there for a very long time because in the wealthier communities, they're not as concerned about getting resources from the state to pay for schools. They'll put their kids in private schools anyway, put their kids in schools in which those in their neighborhood will share their resources, and they just rather not pay any taxes at all. So the first part of it is being really on top of what's going on. When we tell folks it's important to go to those school board meetings, it's for a reason. That's where the details that seem so small continue to add up, and the problems continue to expand. We need, and under these circumstances, we need it in a different way. We know right now, the challenges is we've learned that digital divide is a problem than we realize because we never actually even dreamt of like a pandemic being part of the landscape. So we know as we look to try to educate children from home utilizing those tools, we had all kind of problems. They didn't have the resources for it. They couldn't pay for the broadband internet to come into their homes. A number of people to shift gears along those lines. We've got to fix those problems and see that as part of developing a strong education curriculum as well. If you don't have access to broadband internet in your home, it means it's very difficult for your child to do homework, and a disadvantage to someone that does. If you have a computer that you can truly utilize those things with, the same issue applies. In other words, there's some fundamentals that have changed as we think about the use of technology. And we have to make sure that our communities are keeping up with that as well. Direction is going to be crucial for us. So if there are a number of pieces that we think that people should be focused on and sensitive to. Again, one of our biggest challenges is the realities of how things have been. Ever-changing world, including things like pandemics and whatnot, is something that we've got to catch up with to make sure that our families, our communities, our children have everything they need to be effective and successful in matriculating and getting the education they so dearly need to actually see their dreams fulfilled.
Very good. So listen, we have time just for one more question, Brother Hilary. To sum up, we're all encouraged by some of the changes that are going on in terms of a new administration coming in. The lag, now we talked about the division, the gap between the achievement gap for Blacks students and versus others in America. But what is your sense? Are you encouraged that we have a chance better now to fix some of these problems, to address some of these problems? And you mentioned how so much is going on at the state level. While there's been a change in Washington, to some extent, some of these states are refortifying, becoming a little bit more conservative rather than progressive on educational policy. And of course, there's particularly in the South, and of course, the South may be anything south of the Canadian border. Right. But in terms of the concentration where African Americans and other people of color are located in the urban centers, what's your forecast as the last question for 2021 in terms of what we need to really focus on?
Look, I think what we've done well. People turned out in record numbers. More people came out and voted in the United States of America in this last election than any other time in history. What that means is that we're engaged and we were effective in putting probably the best team on the field that we could do at this point. I mean, it wasn't because we didn't turn out. The biggest problem we ran into was the trickery that was done to prevent our votes from being counted. We'll continue to fight that fight as well. So moving into this, our focus really has to be on making sure that everything is in place. We're going to have that fight, a coordinated fight at those levels. One of the reasons is so many of our organizations, from our civil rights organizations like the NAACP to our religious organizations like the Black church and synagogues and otherwise of African Americans in our country, are so actively engaged. is because we're seeing that the importance of that interconnection and the need for coalition as we move throughout. We may look a little bit differently, but they're coming at all of us with the same problems. We're going to have to find ways to collectively solve those problems and move us ahead. So if you ask me how it's looking, I think we got a tremendous chance. I think we've got a president-elect that seems to hear and is making promises to fulfill the needs that we raised before him. The vice president is historic on so many levels. As we think about the great work that she's done while she was in California, what she's done on Capitol Hill, in the United States Senate, and even watch her campaign before it became part of the Biden campaign, shows that, again, there's a promise here. Keep pushing, don't lose a step, continue to work together. Look at those that have similar agendas and make sure we see how we can, together, arms locked, get things done for our communities. And we'll see as we do that, it will expand itself in many other areas. The upside for us is we're able to actually gain some momentum from 2008 until 2016. Then the backdraft and all the other problems hit with the outcomes of that election. But that was 4 years. It was a setback. And I'm trying to remember the brother's name that says a setback is a setup for a comeback.
Yes.
Under those circumstances, we're in a great situation. Don't think that because we've got somebody else in that White House and got Donald Trump out that our problems are solved. All that means we have the right folks now in the positions to coordinate with all of us. Democracy is the tool that we're utilizing, making the democracy be fair as we move this as well. And we're going to have to fight for that too. But moving ahead in education, it's central to all of that. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. But Ben, we can come back. We'll talk about elections. We'll talk about some other things as well.
Yes.
I think as we're moving into this particular administration at this time, having the setup of a Joe Biden, a Kamala Harris, and as you mentioned, of Congressman Bobby Scott chairing the committee in the House, is the pressure's going to have to be on first supporting Congressman Scott and our friends in the White House, but looking that our biggest fight around these issues is going to be the United States Senate.
Very good. Hilary Shelton, thank you so much. Distinguished Director of the NAACP Washington, D.C. office and Senior Vice President of the NAACP. God bless you, man. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your longevity. And thank you for your continuing commitment to improve the quality of life of all people in America, but particularly those who have been underserved. Thank you.
Brother, thank you. It's always an honor to be with you, Ben. And it's really good to see you.
God bless. Well, thank you, Hilton.